From our ancestors and from previous generations, Lord, we have knowledge of you. They provided the background information about your mercy and goodness. Then as we grew, we used our own energy and effort to learn to know you better. Now we look to future generations who will use our collective religious experience to keep the chain unbroken. We want your goodness and merciful deeds to be heard and known forever and ever. Help us to be faithful storytellers, griots, narrators, and teachers, Lord. Amen.
What is a griot?
I was hoping somebody else knew.
Yeah, you gonna look it up?
We're gonna have a race.
No, we're not, because I lose.
A member of the class of traveling poets, musicians, and storytellers who maintain a tradition of oral history in parts of West Africa.
Traveling poet, if you will, huh?
Traveling poets. Okay. And storytellers. Yeah. And maybe performance artists, right?
We try to use that word twice today.
Call your spouse.
Oh, yeah, that'll go well. Yeah, that's a way of calling them out, right? Okay, well, what did the readings of the video do for you this week? It's to me, I would just say the word belonging. I'm not really sure that fits the readings. I thought the readings were more about like what we call ecclesiology than belonging, but maybe they meant to do the same thing.
It was interesting that he said to be a Christian, you have to be in community. But what about the early fathers? They were in community.
There were only a few solitary hermits, right? I mean, many of the early fathers did live in these monasteries, but people like Saint Anthony, right, who totally lived in isolation. I don't know if you know about him. He tried to live in isolation, and people like kept wanting to live by him, so he kept having to move because he wanted to be in isolation. There's not too many of those folks, but that is an interesting question, though, right? We do have these like very marginal tradition of like hermits who are very like noteworthy. Although I would say like we know about them because people came to consult them. So maybe they did spend a lot of time on their own, but they had some kind of community connection, I suppose.
Well, the monasteries, because you have to be invited into the monastery to become a member. How would that fit into a church?
Well, I see that going both ways. And like there are some monastic traditions that like would take people who were just looking for sanctuary or asylum, right? They would bring them in. So they weren't invited. They were like, oh, we don't know if you got what it takes to be a monk, but you're here. So let's give it a go. And I would tell you, I see both kinds of churches out there. Ones in which you have to be invited, and ones that say, we'll take you like you are.
Without the church, we cannot be Christians. I have a big problem with it. I agree that the church is the way we should. I mean, that's the ideal way. And I agree that we as people need group, church, belonging. But this is very exclusionary. And I'm uncomfortable.
What if I gave you the Saint Cyprian quote, there is no salvation outside the church?
Same reaction.
So I'm wondering if it's because, well, I didn't know because, I get it, the concern. And what do you think church means in that phrase?
But you said you can't be a Christian.
You can't be a Christian outside the church. What does church mean in that context?
Maybe different than what we thought. Maybe we thought church might have been a group of believers supporting, loving each other, and serving together. I don't
It's
know.
not.
There was a long time that I was not in,
Mhm.
a long time.
In an institutional church.
Right, right. But I still consider myself Christian, connected to the body of faith. Even exploring other religions and participating in other religions.
Mhm.
I still saw myself as a Christian. Give us the definition of a Christian. And what people are using to discuss.
No, the definition linguistically is little Christ. Christian means little Christ.
Then what does that mean?
Well, I mean, so keep in mind the first believers weren't called Christians, they were called the Way with a capital W. And actually, the word Christian comes from a letter like from Pliny the Elder that talks about these Christians, and it's probably like a pejorative term, actually, because these are people who are acting like this Christ figure. So it has nothing to, well, I guess you could say it has something to do with belief, but the core of the word is, do you embody in proclamation, deed, and speech, Jesus,
Which fits the way
which fits the way.
much better than like
Could sound really weird, right? Gandhi didn't identify as a Christian. Did he practice the way of Jesus? I think so. It's a little bit disrespectful for me to say, therefore, Gandhi is a Christian, although I would say that also, why not? And I'm pushing on church a little bit, not because you're wrong, but because church means two different things. And most of us, when we say church, we think of a church instead of the thing that you said, which is really like a community of folk, right? Who are called out, right? Who are called out. And I would actually say sometimes I can't find church with a capital C inside of churches. And this is where language gets tough, right? Because we've so institutionalized this word. And just keep in mind, historically, there weren't any public churches until 313 because they weren't legal. We went to the oldest church in the world, and what do you know? It's like underground, hidden. That was a public gathering room. So when Constantine made Christianity legally tolerated, then there could be public buildings. Otherwise, people met in homes. So like before the year 313, when people talked about church, they weren't talking about church as, they were talking about this mystical idea of a community that's gathered around embodying Jesus. And I think if I said it that way, then probably you can really only be a Christian if you are a member of the church. You can only be a little Christ if you're part of embodying Christ. That just, I mean, that's not a stretch.
I grew up in a very strange situation in that I went to Catholic school, and there was public school in the town, but this is a small South Texas town. But the Catholic girls, to some extent, encouraged by the nuns, thought of the public school girls as bad girls because they were not.
Because they were bad.
Because they did not come to mass, they did not do the Stations of the Cross, they didn't do Lamb's Wood. And when I
Big meat on Friday.
And but for me personally, because I was the only one that stayed in the town, the other girls I was with in Catholic school were what was in the little town of Elsie. They went on to Our Lady of the Lake and other places, but I stayed in the public school, and I was ostracized horribly by the public school, It took a year, and it was a very painful time because the public school kids never went to church, or very rarely, really ostracized. And because I was alone, I was the only one. It was really difficult, so I find that battle so brings back the attention.
Yeah, and I actually think that's a little bit of what you're speaking to, Darlene, and what I think we could hear in the video at one level is this whole idea of like being called out, and once you're called out, you're different and maybe better. And there has been this tradition, like I grew up in this tradition of sacred and secular, and because we were like part of the church, we were like the good people, and then there's this like lost folk we go to school with. Of course, when you have that attitude, like people don't like you, so it just kind of supports it on itself, right? That, oh, Christians are different because they're jerks, we're different because we're better, and like that sort of happens. And that's, I think, some of the danger of some of this face value language. And that's where I would love you to hear this word ecclesia. I keep hearing it in the Southern way, like we're called out. And what God would like to call us out on is that tribalism.
It's just practically the same.
Yeah. Well, because it's from a Latin root. Oh, well, actually, it's a Greek root, but yeah, Latin sucked it in. Yeah. No salvation outside the church. Depending on the definitions, I could agree with that. I could, although at the normal term, I couldn't.
Okay, so what happened to all people before Abraham?
Same thing that happens to us. That's what I'd say. I had a thought this morning, and it's about the Trinity. And it may drive you nuts. And you can just sort of say that was stupid and I hate it. But I just want to walk you down a couple of steps and see what you think. This is the image of Trinity that came to my head, right? What's the word of God? It's so funny because I grew up in a church that said the word of God's the Bible. But the Bible itself testifies that the word of God is actually Jesus. So the Bible is not the word of God, period, dot, according to the Bible.
And for a Catholic girl in South Texas, it was the catechism. The catechism is the Bible.
And that's still wrong. It's Jesus, right? So Jesus is the word of God. Now think through, I've told you this before. There was this philosopher named Wittgenstein, and there's some other theologians who have done this, who sort of say, and we've talked about this for a couple of weeks, how awkward language can be, right? Like sometimes the words just are like weird, like when we talk about the Trinity being 3 in 1 at the same time, linguistically, that doesn't work really well. But I was thinking this morning, like I had this really weird thought, Trinitarian image. And I mentioned this line to you before. Sometimes we thank God for our language, but this theologian, John Dominic Crossan, said, because we need language as human beings, like this is part of the human experience, we use language to understand reality. We might say, thank language for God. Because without language, what would we do? How would we process? So God creates. Jesus is the gift of language. The word is relatable. It's how we categorize and understand God. And then the Spirit says, but there's more than just limited language.
Well, I have to tell you that this whole week, I constantly have this thing that the Trinity
A party?
Really, all week long I had thought of that. And it just makes me smile.
Well, that seems loving. If you think through, God is the raw material creator. Jesus is the way we understand and categorize creation. And the Spirit says, and keep going. And this is where the word, through which we understand all things. This is probably why we focus on the word of Jesus, because like that's relatable and categorizable. And that's why we have a hard time with the Spirit, because the Spirit said, yeah, but your language has limits. to say this, right? Because God is greater than our language. All theology is blasphemy. All of it. And that's the Holy Spirit. And Jesus is the language. And God is the source of everything that is. That was my Trinitarian image this morning. And it makes me wonder if church isn't sticky because we've left out the Spirit pushing us past the limits of our language. The church. Well, who's in the church? Well, we are, because we're at a church. Do the Lutherans make the cut? Yeah, some of them maybe. Do the Mormons make the cut? They think so, but we don't think so. You know what I mean? Like, this is sort of the deal. We get stuck in denominationalism or tribes instead of the church are people that God has called out. Not to be different, but maybe called us out because we want to be different. I'm calling you out, Mike. Stop acting like you're different because you're not. That's how you be part of the church.
Well, that's kind of beautiful. I mean, that's, you know,
I didn't mean to turn into preacher on this study, but
No,
that's
no,
just
but
what I was thinking of.
That's a creative way of sort of to look at humanity. And this is my bicycle riding when I spent a lot of time by myself on the bike. But when I did with people that were like other bikers, there was an immediate connection, an immediate connection, an immediate community. We'd be in some schools or we'd be sleeping in the classrooms and sleeping bags with strangers. But we were totally safe because we were connected. We were there for the same thing.
And I think that experience of we have a love of dogs in common, that helps us be friends. That's the spoken word of Jesus. It's relatable. It's categorizable. We've got this thing in common. And then what about someone who hates dogs? I would need the Holy Spirit. And that's like some ways in which the Trinity functions. We look together according to similarities. We do, our brains evolve to do that. And the Spirit says, and keep going. And I wonder if that isn't part of like some of the issues we have with church is we stopped at the spoken word and we didn't keep pushing the limits of language. And maybe we need this Trinitarian understanding in order to actually be this called out group of folk. My dad told me this at a young age. My dad had like 7 things he said that were pretty good. And I remember most of them. And this is one of those things it's like an enigmatic, you've probably heard it before. The minute you think you're different from everybody else is the minute you're just like everybody else. That seems like a pretty good like rider to what it means to be church. To me. And maybe that's the difference between a priesthood and a royal priesthood. Or a holy priesthood. Priests say, these are my people. Holy priests say, we're all God's people. So how do I mediate for all of God's people, not stand between us and God, but help us realize that God is standing amongst us already?
We're in lots of communities. You know, not just women. So we meet people in other communities because of spirit senses, spirit beliefs, and you know, other things. And yet we're all connected.
When we travel, there's so much strength of traveling, hiking, biking, just walking with strangers. That because we were people, but we were all doing a lot of the same thing. We were welcoming and embraced and mature and where we were. So you could sleep next to some guy you didn't know in a sleeping bag, and that was fine. I don't know if it really fits, but there was a sense of being part of God's people out there. There was no church there, no formal church. There's no priest with it. Except I carried the hands that I carried the communion and I don't have the priests. At least I never got a flat tire on the river yesterday. And I was on my own, I was by myself. It was really. I think it is about the host.
Well, and I would say like what you said, I think absolutely fits an understanding of church that is like functionally right, even though it's not within a building. And I don't know if this lesson wants to push us, but I'm glad for us to push beyond that, right? Like I would tell you from my perspective that when people from the community show up to hand out food, even if they're not religiously affiliated, I think that food distribution is church. It's people who are calling out a problem and calling out a solution. And by supporting both of those things, they are being called out. Would I say that if somebody came as a Sikh or as a Muslim, that they were being church? Well, I would, because that's my language. Right? They don't have to fit, but that fits my concept of what that looks like, even though they may find that my goal is not to offend them, it's to say you're part of us embodying what God would have us do. Calling out inequity, calling out a solution, right? And in so doing, being called out.
Could they be part when you had the diagram? They can be part of the church here and part of the church at watch. Part of the church.
Yeah, I think so. Now, I wouldn't be offended if a Muslim told me, hey, you're part of the mosque on earth. I actually would not find that offensive. It would take me a minute to like process that because it's not my language. But I would actually find that lovely that they consider me to be an embodiment of their own religion through language. If a Jewish person told me, oh, when you do that, you're helping mend the world, you're part of Tikkun Olam, I would find that very touching, actually. I wouldn't be like, I'm being church, I'm not being that Jewish thing. So I get it. I don't want to say a Muslim would love for me to say you're being part of church, but I hope you're hearing the bigger umbrella part.
Well, I'm thinking we can do more together. We should change that. We should say we are doing more together, so keep going.
Well, then it's too long. It's too much of a catchphrase. Yeah. I actually thought a couple of years ago we could make it even shorter, which could be like more together, but that could start to be a brag, like we're more together than you, right? Or together more. I mean, like there's lots of different permutations on that and that makes sense. And that's where I think his first question that's really interesting is religion private or is religion necessarily public? And my understanding of religion is it's a way of life. So that has to be, if that's not public, you're going to have the crisis of despair when you get to your 80s because you won't have integrity. Says Eric Erickson, right? In our 80s, we either have integrity, we look back on our life and say, yep, I had integrity, or I was scattered, and so I've got despair. So I think if religion's private, you don't have integrity. If your way of life is your way of life. That's what I would think.
For me, I'm very basic, but for me, church is just a starting place. And then you take this that's in you out into the world. And then the way you live and what you show is what people say, well, that church or that Christian attitude, I like that, and tell me more about it. The beacon, I guess.
And I would agree with you in the sense that, look, if there's, you could say whatever you want to somebody, but if there's no embodiment that's appealing, your words are empty, right? I mean, it is an interesting thing to think through. if the biggest public thing we do here is a Sunday service, right? In which it revolves around, I thank God for the Eucharist, but otherwise it revolves around a spoken word. And not even a dialogue, a spoken word. Like we've evolved into this model. I'm grateful for the Eucharist because no matter what happened, we always end there, right? Always end there. Yeah. But I don't know that we, it's interesting what we've institutionalized is hearing, thinking, and not necessarily serving, doing reconciliation. No, we have the peace. And a long time ago, the peace was like, y'all better fix your problems or I'm not giving you the communion. So people did that publicly, and the peace could last a long time. Here it's kind of like, hey, my wife goes to the bathroom because people might shake her hand. So she hides, right? So because she don't want like hugging and stuff like that. But just consider that even like the peace is really more of the greeting than it is the peacemaking and the smoothing over. In fact, I would tell you one of the things churches don't do well in general is facilitate people being reconciled within the church. I'm having a problem with you, I'm going to a different church, or I'm going to a different service, or I'm sitting on the other side. I'm not saying here, I'm just saying in general. This is like how we work. To our peril, I think, to our peril. And I think maybe that's why people under the age of 60 are increasingly like not going to church because they don't have to anymore. It's not socially advantageous. So if I'm going to be like mistreated, I don't have to go. I don't have to do that. Or, hey, I've grown up a long time seeing how church reinforces tribalism. So like, why do I want to do that? People under 30 are so ahead of us socially, morally, progressively, whether you agree with their stances or not. Their basic stances are about inclusion. And we're still trying to figure out whether women can be priests. They're like 50 years beyond us, right? And I get that sometimes, hey, gender fluidity is really confusing. It's actually confusing to me, but that's just a way in which, if you think about the concept, how younger folk are ahead of us. And what in the institutionalization of acceptance. I know really strong anti-gay parents who are 60 have raised their kids to be anti-gay, and they're like, "You're nuts!" Like, hey, we're 25. It's 2023. Like, come on into the 21st century. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's not because the parents did a bad job. It's because like here's where we live. And still in church, we're like trying to figure out these things that our children and our grandchildren are way ahead of us on.
How come? Our country is so frightening. And young people feel that. And still, they have a lot of people who are excluded.
Yeah, I actually think, Susan, and I've read an article about this in the Atlantic too, how like France is really worried about US wokeness. And I think part of it is because as human beings, our brain doesn't like to hold on to tension. So was Martin Luther King a good guy or a bad guy? Well, he was a good guy, right? He's a good guy. Our brain's like, good guy, right? I don't know if his wife would say that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if his kids would agree. But like for us, it's like, oh, what do you mean? Like he was really good and then he was bad to his wife. Which category do we put him in now? Because our brain doesn't like, he was a regular person. Now, look, when you watch that guy leading the march at the age of 35, I'm like, geez, what have I been doing with my life, right? Like that guy changed voter registration laws in his 30s. Ooh, I better like get to work. But our brains don't like to hold that tension. They just don't. And I see less discipline for holding that tension now. across all age groups. It doesn't matter why, that's what I see. You're Republican, that's bad bucket, you're bad. You're Democrat, bad bucket, anything you propose comes out of the bad bucket, I'm gonna block it. Hey, you're my mom and dad, but like I'm attracted to somebody of a different gender and you don't support that, so everything's bad. Look, that's hard, but not everything's bad. You get what I'm saying? And I think in some ways we've gravitated toward that. And that's what I hear when I hear this today. It's like maybe we're being called out of that.
There in the paper today, there was a story about an article about how the growth of private schools in continuing the ultra-conservative or the teaching those values among the kids. And that's concern about should we or should we not, have vouchers for students.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of, let's not pretend like if we closed all the private schools, it would help all the public schools. Because you all know that the PTO can raise money for different teachers. So if you live in a rich district, your school can function just like a private school. Because they had 2 carnivals and a bake sale that made $300,000. But I do think that has been an ongoing struggle, how we educate and how we respond to education. And again, I think a lot of this has to do with this concern about wholesale categorization of other people. I saw it here. Look, we had this like terrible thing happen in our school last year. We did. And as a result, like our enrollment's way down. But part of the terrible thing that happened that I couldn't understand at the time, and I still actually don't understand, is that we had school on Columbus Day, and we called it Indigenous Peoples Day. And the first grade teacher sent home a worksheet about Indigenous peoples, and a couple of parents lost their mind. And I mean for the year. They lost their mind over this worksheet because why weren't we celebrating Columbus Day? And on the worksheet, it claimed that Columbus discovered North America. And there was this claim that went out, that's factually incorrect. He discovered the Bahamas. What continent do the Bahamas belong to? I mean, I just couldn't believe that that was a thing. They were saying that it was factually inaccurate to hide, I don't know if they even knew this, to hide their upsetness about how the indigenous people didn't actually get so many gifts out of this. Why we're afraid to say that, I don't know.
Because it uses our feeling of superiority.
And I don't even get how it does. I'm so powerful that my disease has decimated a whole continent without killing me. That makes me even more powerful.
What does woke mean?
Means you're awake and everybody else is asleep. And now what it means is you know how to use language correctly. But really what it means is like, I'm not sleeping through institutional racism and sexism. I have. Mhm.
It comes from the vernacular. We woke up.
We woke up.
I've heard it
Yeah.
now for several years, but never really did understand what it meant.
I mean, increasingly what it means is you belong to the good old boys network.
And if you don't belong, or don't feel that you're belonging, you need to belong, are you any victim?
I think you're still asleep.
Unless you believe in critical race theory, then you're not as woke as you think you are.
And consider this, like just as an example, right? There's all this concern about critical race theory, and that's just another way of bifurcating who's in the bad bucket and the good bucket. on either side.
And critical race theory is.
Extremely misunderstood. For most people, what it means is accentuating non-normalized history. I didn't learn in school that Andrew Jackson defied the Supreme Court when he caused the Cherokee to go on the Trail of Tears. I didn't learn that. Why are we teaching our kids that? Because it's critical race theory, because these bleeding heart liberals.
To me, it means it,
Critical man. Like, you're critically ill. And it is, it's that critical, not criticism.
Critical race theory, what it really is supposed to mean is, right, examining historical patterns with an eye to institutional racism.
and if you grew up in a privileged environment,
Hmm.
it's very difficult for you to see institutional racism, even if you think you do. You don't.
So like if you said during the 1800s, the US interior policy operated under the doctrine of manifest destiny and believed that their rights superseded those of the indigenous people. Look, those indigenous people, they weren't even like being productive with the land. They were like wasting it. So we gave them civilization. We made the land productive. That's the history I learned. Critical race theory says we subjugated a lot of people.
Okay, so our history book. And of course, I knew they were written from a certain perspective. Okay, because the history books in Texas are not like the history books in, New England or whatever. But this is saying, let's go beyond what is written to what is actual, right?
Yeah, and that may expose normally accepted understandings of history to be suffused with institutional racism. Why did we fight the Civil War? What's the main reason we fought the Civil War?
It was an economic.
Money.
My mom learned in Kentucky, it was a war of economics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a war over states' rights. That's the war of Northern aggression. Never mind that economics was completely based on slavery. So instead of saying slavery, we call it an economic problem. Even though those two things are holding hands like really tight. Well, the South was making more money than the North. That's why the North fought the war, because they weren't paying for labor. Critical race theory asked to say, let's go beyond the economics and talk about how economics was embodied. Oh, the Native Americans, they did this and that. Critical race theory says how many treaties were made and how many were broken. Now, you can see people get wild on both ends. What I'm trying to name is even in schools, right, that we're seeing this categorization of the bends. Your school's bad because you didn't do Columbus Day. Your school's bad because you did do Columbus Day. The whole thing, not, I see this opportunity for you to have a more rounded out pedagogy. It's just bad.
When I was teaching US history, I could teach history about World War II, but I was strictly forbidden to teach about Belgium. Where was this? But I taught politics in Dickinson. I was told it's not on the test, don't teach it.
Yeah, and so
How
look,
can you teach the Second World War without teaching that?
it was the war of German aggression. Isn't that how you learned it? It was the war of German aggression. That's how I learned it. Never mind, right, that like the whole country had been humiliated and subjugated to like terrible bits after World War I, which was also the War of German aggression.
As was the French First War.
That one probably was the War of German aggression.
But what did that have to do with? What the war of aggression? But what does that have to do with denying the Holocaust? See, I don't understand how anybody can deny that the Holocaust happened.
Well, I'm not sure that it.
Don't you want to deny the Holocaust happened? I do. I would like to deny that something like that happened.
I would like to hope it never happened again.
Oh, you're even more optimistic than I am.
No.
I don't even want to imagine that human beings were capable of that.
Why couldn't you?
It'd be easier if it just didn't happen, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but it did. It was fine.
But this is where we find ourselves. I think.
And it still happened, yeah. I agree
It's
with
in
you.
your mind.
So this, I think, comes back to this question that we're being asked about being called out and what's it mean to be part of church and to be Christian. And how do we navigate those differences? Well, so-and-so says the Holocaust didn't happen. I'm not talking to them again. That's just so unreasonable.
Well, yeah,
That's how the Holocaust happened.
that's divine.
And that's the tough bit, isn't it? When we buy into that, it reinforces the thing we were worried about in the beginning, and not buying into it is really hard.
The last thing he said right now in this nation, the one side, at the end of the other, they won't listen to each other. They're not open-minded to hear. They're not agreeing with something the other side said, if they'll listen.
I don't think most of us are open-minded. I like talking to people who think like I do. It's nice, isn't it? Can I tell you this fun story? There used to be this guy here, Jim Needler. He was like a real big in the scouting community, and he would always write these little thoughts down called the Gospel According to Needler. And he had this friend who was like a medical missionary in somewhere really poor. I don't know, Ghana or Haiti or something like that. And the missionary had this kid who was like 16 and grew up, you know, with his dad, right? And so I don't know how this happened, but Jim was leading this boy on a hike in Philmont because he was a scout. And they got to this vista and they're looking out over the vista. And Jim said, "Wow, isn't this beautiful?" And the boy said, he didn't even miss a beat, "Yeah, there's no sick people here."
Yeah, why?
There's no sick people. So it depends on your person.
If you don't mind me saying, I understand it's not the healthy people who need a doctor, it's the sick. Sometimes I'm really glad not to be around sick people. I got my own illnesses. But on my ward that I live in, since we all share those, it's a little easier, right? It's the people in the other wards, well, I know they need a doctor, but God, sometimes I could just use a break. This is part of the struggle with being church. And sometimes it's easier to say, let's just put a door at the end of our ward. Y'all have your ward. Maybe we'll see each other in the hallways, but we don't even need to visit much. Because it's hard.
Put down the locks and learn something. You know, the pandemic shut down everything. And now they're starting to open up again. And one of the things that they used to do is to allow the homeless people to go down into the basement and pick out clothes. Well, that stopped during the pandemic. And sometimes, and they have to have police officers there to maintain
Order.
order. And the people that were handing out clothes would get a little nervous about some of the people who were coming down to get the clothes. So what they've done is people come and they say, oh, I need a pair of pants, a shirt and some shoes. And somebody will go into the basement and pick those up and deliver it to them. And the new guy that's in charge is saying, we're gonna soon, we're gonna allow them to go down to pick their own things up. It's that important. But then you have to worry about maintaining order and the whole 9 yards. And there's this dichotomy because between I want to help others, but on my terms that keeps you safe, and I don't, maybe that's such. Sometimes I think that happens.
The difference between help and accompaniment is that when I help you, I decide when I'm done. When I accompany you, you decide when I'm done. I'd rather be a helper because I'm in control of my own life.
There's also the issue of what we call compassion fatigue. You know, those of us who help others constantly and with our whole heart, and we hear really hard things to hear over and over. There gets to be a point sometimes when we are so fatigued that we put off those feelings in order to protect ourselves. We don't have compassion anymore because we're drained. And then that's when we have to have compassion for ourselves and take care of ourselves so that we can be the real compassionate person we want to be. And it's self-preservation.
And that's perfectly fine. And I was an inner city principal for years. I always
It just
was
happens.
inner city. And the kids were, were hard. But whenever I wasn't there anymore, was when I retired, I missed them. And one time I was came in with my bike, and there was a truck in front of the house. And the kids said, "Dad, wait, stop! You can't go yet." The driver was being told by an English person, "You can't go, you can't go." This is my principal's house. She told me like this to go with you. And then I came on the bike. This is your house. Yes, this is my house. And you can do it. So that just, you're not gonna get big bundles of money, but you can get some memories like that or incidents like that happen. We've had things like that come back to us. It's just every once in a while. Not anymore because we're so old. But
Well, this is, as Mike says, we're challenged, to be Christians, and I think of a couple of men in our church who've taken care of their wives. Their wives had legitimate diseases for years and years and years. And I'm always critical of myself because the only thing I can think of is my wife Donna. Don't get that disease because I'm not sure I can rise to the occasion like these. And there's women who do the same thing. I just look at it from a man's perspective, because I'm thinking that could be me. But that's what we're challenged.
And it can be so fatiguing
Yes.
that I mean, I'm not calling names out here, but like I've got a parishioner who took care of his wife for like 12 years. And when she died, he didn't even know what to do. And I don't mean for a couple of weeks. I mean like a couple of years later, was on the same schedule of only leaving the house once a week to go grocery shopping during a particular window of time. It's not wrong. It's when like caregiving can take over. And this is where I think coming back to what he said at the beginning that I don't want to agree with, but in some ways it like it's important. That's why we need a community.
And it's also a factor in our grieving process when we've taken care of someone for so long. And it's so exhausting that when they finally die, there's a sense of relief.
And then there's guilt over the
And
relief.
guilt over the relief. And that's normal. Those are normal feelings that if we would realize it's normal, then we wouldn't beat ourselves up so much about the guilt with the guilt. So you can mourn and the loss, but also be so grateful that you don't have to do that.
And recognize that there's something natural to both things and they're not a conflict.
Yes.
Yeah.
They can exist together in the same.
The hardest part for me is the terrible feeling of loneliness because I didn't have to go down to South Africa to take care of that, that is a kind of nursing home, and I didn't have a reason for getting in the car and driving down there. There was like a people in the north that was just saying everything.
Then there's the clergy.
Yes.
And I would tell you what I see as a younger clergy person, as I see clergy people retire and they don't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah.
And I think I've told you this before, they're not important anymore. They used to go into church and they're like, father this, mother that. And like, now they're just a regular person.
Who am I?
Who am I and how do I be vulnerable? Because I'll tell you in seminary, they tell us you don't make friends with parishioners. Creates conflicts of interest. So in general, the model we get is like priest needs to be taking care of the community and your community is not allowed to take care of you.
That's so bad.
Well, we've seen it go poorly when priest and congregation become codependent. And I've seen priests who expect their people to take care of them, whether they know that or not. I mean, totally take care of them. That starts to become maybe like off kilter. And I think probably because it's so hard for us to decide the tension, the advice is live outside the tension, be the caregiver. Because the lines are cleaner. Well, if you have friends within the parish, other people will be jealous. I had friends in middle school and other people were jealous. Like, welcome to life. The question is, what do you do with your friendships in your parish? Do you give pastoral privilege? That's such a funny idea. Well, you'll visit your friends in the hospital before you'll visit. Really? But these are some weird things. And caregiver fatigue in as a clergy person, are you allowed to say your doubts in front of people? Because, well, you could lead other people astray. So no, you just need to stick to the party line. It's not just clergy, though. It's like we all come here. I'm afraid to share my doubts because people will judge me. Is that part of being called out? Or is that something God's trying to call out of us? I mean, part of my job as a chaplain at a heart hospital was to make sure doctors honor the do not request in the chart because they didn't want to. What they wanted to do was preserve life at all costs because that was their medical training. So like often chaplains have to say, no, doctor, this is a DNR.
Also, when I worked in the schools as a student psychologist, a big part of my job was taking care of the teachers because they were so exhausted. And then that way they could take care of their kiddos. Yes, I was there for the kids, but a big part of it was supporting the teachers to ensure they were taking care of their students and getting that compassion.
That they bring home, right? And it's hard being a teacher because you're around other kids. You come home to your kids, and a lot of times it's like, you will not be like Adam.
Yeah.
Or like, I've been around this all day. There's nothing cute about what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, a priest is a caregiver, 24/7, unfortunately. And I like one of the bounds you set on emails.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's I thought, why didn't I do that 20 years ago? Monday to Friday, whatever.
what's interesting is nobody's complained about that boundary here. I was been very surprised by that.
We've worried about this for years.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, priests are caregivers all the time. They never get a break. And like you say, I like to control my life, but then that phone rings and then you lose control and you don't get to choose. They choose for it. So it's tough. I contacted Mike yesterday about somebody who needed to visit. He'd already been there.
But sometimes I haven't. So that's why we do this together, right? That's why we do it together. Yeah, and I think this is like really a key part, right? And it permeates every level of like, what does membership or participation look like? And I know this wasn't like a thing in the readings, but I'm stuck on this word belonging because it's one of Brene Brown's big words, is the difference between belonging and fitting in. Right? Fitting in is where you do what I say in order to be acceptable. Belonging is you're acceptable like you are. And I think a lot of organizations of people practice fitting in. And fitting in is really compelling because you have another family you fit in. Gangs are like, they're really strong culture. Do these things, you're one of us. Do them. But you have to do what we say. And if you do that, then you'll be one of us. That's fitting in. If you stop doing what we say, you don't fit anymore. You're not one of us. That's really, really different from belonging. I'm hard pressed to tell you organizations where people just belong in general. They just are hard to come up with. I'm not sure most individual churches I've been a part of are anchored in belonging more than fitting in. If you don't mind me saying.
Schools have to be belong to the places. Because if they just are fitting in places, there are kids that are gonna be out there. But if they feel that they belong, then they turn around to another kid and say, no, it's really good in school because you belong. You're part of what's going on. I'll just tell you this really fast. When I took over a school, everybody had a board of education. The big stick for everybody.
Yes.
And I picked them all up and I took it to the board and I said, you boards of education. But then I heard them back, I could go back to the school and I say to kids, I could say to kids, I don't hit you, none of my people hit you, I don't let anybody hit you, you don't hit each other.
Each way. He's walking down the hallway. Getting tired at the desk. And he's a big man. And he went over there and picked that up. And he said, this is our space. So that, that's a good thing for someone to have. And
You have to keep it clear.
and it'd be nice if every place was like that.
Because people decided they belonged there and they belong together. Of course, as we all know, the hardest thing is how do I practice belonging with somebody who doesn't think I belong? That's really hard. That's probably why God calls us out, if you don't mind me saying. That's why I that's why I have really strong thoughts about children in the sanctuary. Either they belong or they don't belong. If they have to fit in, they didn't belong.
I think that the granddaughter that just kind of what you get, right? And it's fun.
His granddaughter is so much better than my daughter. When I say better, she didn't walk down the aisle, she walked around the chancel. She climbed on top of me. Your gift to me was, most of you, that belongs. Some people said that doesn't fit in. Actually, most of those folks had even changed their mind, which I'm grateful for. Really what that means is they open their heart to think through, what are we doing here, right?
Yes, Mike gave my daughter permission to let my granddaughter wander a little bit, which causes me to grit my, are you hearing me grit my teeth?
I can see it. From about here.
I'm thinking, well, I did not say that.
It's fine.
But
Thank you. Thank you.
it's standing there at the, I mean, at the rail. Was so sweet.
I
She feels
raised
like
my
she belongs.
children at St. Peter's, Pasadena. That's where I started and, you know, our whole life centered around the church. And recently, my daughter's 43 years old now. And recently we were just chatting and she said, you know where I felt the most comfortable growing up? And I said, you know, in your room? She says, no, in the parish hall at St. Peter's, Pasadena. She said that felt like home to me. When I walked in there, there was a smell. There were people that bought me donuts, that got white sugar all over my clothes. And it just felt like home to me. And in all her life, she'd never told me that before.
Hmm.
But that's where she felt like she belonged.
Must be nice to you.
It's a mystery of love, and we were talking about this at the men's group yesterday morning. Mystery of love, especially the first maybe 5 or 6 years of our marriage. I don't know about now, but the first 5 or 6 years of marriage, my wife would do things that nobody else was allowed to do because they would have driven me nuts. And it wasn't that I didn't see them; it's just that I decided they weren't going to bother me. That probably lasted 5 or 6 years. And then we kind of go up and down, if I'm honest. But it's a mystery of love, especially when love is like new and fresh, right? That those things that would normally irritate the hell out of us are like somehow curious or like cute. And I wonder, like, I don't know how to turn that on. That's why I think there's a mystery to love. Like, I don't know how I turned those switches on from annoyance to like cute early on, but that happened. And I think maybe belonging is like that. And how we do that more and more with each other, it probably just means taking a little more time to say, instead of I don't like that, I wonder what that means for you. Most of the time, I would say it this way. I wonder what that means to you. Instead of, I wonder, what does that mean for you?
We used to have these rails that went into the darkness. And it was a food that just drew the children. The children loved those rails. And they would swing on them and they would throw their bodies over them and some of the ladies in the church that would upset them because they didn't think the children should do that. And then there were others who were concerned that they were hurting children or whatever like that. And then we redid and the rails were gone. And somebody said to me, it makes me the most rich plan with the rails.
All right, you ready for a tough one? Happens anytime a church in a school or anytime there's other people who use a church. Inevitably it happens, something didn't get put away. There's 2 dirty dishes on the counter. Those school people aren't treating our building right. Is that a fitting in statement or a belonging statement? It's not a belonging statement. You ever had people live in your house? Did they do all the things you wanted? And they still belonged, didn't they? And that's part of what drove you nuts. How can you leave dirty dishes in your room? I still don't understand that. I don't understand how anybody can do that, except for all 3 people I live with do that. I don't do that. Just to be very clear, that is not my vice. I have other ones. That isn't it.
Glasses in the bathroom.
Yeah, my girls do that too. And I might say it drives me nuts, but I never say, how can you do that to my house? Because it's ours. Anytime we say things like, the Scouts are blank, it means they don't fit in. Instead of, hey, our building, we need this. We are our. Small phrases that come from sharing, and sharing's hard. Because there's people who never clean up after themselves. They're called our children, right? I mean, like, this is a thing. And there are kids, and we don't always extend that courtesy to other people because we forget this understanding of family and belonging. That said, if we're not going to treat the facility well, we're going to have to put limits on how we use it. I do that at home.
Darlene, you're as senior warden, you'll learn we have a facility use policy here, which our priest violates all the time. He just it's open for everyone. And now, in a good way, you know what I'm saying? We're probably overly restricted in how we do that.
And my role as senior board needs to have discussion.
No, just encourage,
Well, and I would tell you, like, look, this is actually, I think, part of where being like really open and cultivating belonging, it is exhausting, because when people want to use your facility and you say that's what it's for, you're on the clock even more than you already were.
And you've done more funeral hears for non-members than members. Sure.
I call that a mark of success.
Oh, yeah. Baptisms too.
I call that a mark of success, right? It's how we define the stuff that seems really, really important. And I would tell you, it's really tiring.
Well, and I was told at one point to treat your guests like your family.
Oh, we usually treat our guests much different from our family. We put on our best behavior so we're not authentic anymore. Right? Clean the house before the guests come. They don't want to see how we live. I had to say, I got to the point with some friends in San Diego where I had to say, come over for dinner and I'm not cleaning the house. And they probably thought, what on earth is his problem? But if I had to clean, I wouldn't have had the energy to have them over. So I had to say, I'm not cleaning for you. I needed, they did not need to hear that. I needed to say that.
Well, I am in the process of selling my house, so I have to get up in the morning and make sure everything looks perfect, right? I have my cup of coffee, and then I have to rinse it and put it in the dishwasher so it's not seen by anybody. And I'm going, I don't do this for me. I have to do this for strangers.
One of the most profound memories that I have of being a young mom, I would wash the clothes and throw them on the couch. Wash the clothes, throw them on the couch. And then eventually, when I had time, I told them. But the girls always knew to go get their panties and stuff off the couch. It was just the way we lived. Well, the doorbell rang one day, and it was the wife of a man that David worked with. And she had been sent over there for some reason unbeknownst to me. So I said, well, here we go. I said, come on in and I'll move the clothes so you can sit down. She goes, oh, thank God. She said, you're the most real person I've ever met in my life.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I did. I didn't leave her outside to go stand and talk on the porch. I just moved the clothes. But she had a place to sit.
Do you read the scriptures? I'm going to tell you, most of the scriptures this week, they didn't even match for me, honestly. And a lot of the readings from the theology book didn't do a lot for me either. But I just didn't. I thought the theme was a little bit weak. Sorry. But I value the discussion. I do want to say, though, there were these two interesting passages that came side by side. You're Peter, on this rock I'll build my church, and you'll have the gates, you'll have the keys, right? And against the church, hell will not prevail. Keys. And on the papal flag, right, it's the keys. Because the Pope has the keys to the church. And then the next reading is Revelation. And there's 12 gates to the holy city. And I don't know if you noticed, the gates are never closed. So what does Peter do with the keys? Unlocks every door, locks no doors. The prayer book allows me to withhold communion from somebody who is not penitent. Probably for the first time in my life, I thought about that practice a few weeks ago. I mean, I really did. I wanted to say, look, you've injured me, and until we have some reconciliation, I just, we need to figure this out. I think we're supposed to unlock the doors. Maybe receiving the communion gives you the energy you need to settle down, instead of you have to earn it. I don't know. Well, next week, we'll talk about the body of Christ.
This was
Very
great.
good,
This
yes.
was very good.